Today, Faversham Creek is a quiet backwater. A few pleasure craft, some old boats being lovingly restored, but nothing to disturb the peace of this beautiful Kentish town. But it wasn't always like this.
People can't believe that we built boats.
I mean, if you actually heard the noise and you heard the, like the sound like ringing over Faversham, I mean, then you would be curious what that is. And to see the broadside launch as well, would be fantastic.
It was quite an event, not only for the workmen, but for all the people in Faversham. The schools took their children to the other side of the creek to watch what was going on.
They used to bring parties of school children down to watch it, and of course if they was allowed to get too close to the quay side on the opposite bank of the shipyard, I mean the wave, like a tidal wave, they'd get rigged.
Before I went down the shipyard, when we started from school, it was a regular thing. No other launch down there, all the street, Abbey Street, and people from Faversham down to watch it. Sometimes one boat occasionally the normal way, but 9 times out of 10, the side of the launch.
The sideways launch, whilst not unique to Faversham, was quite a major feature of launches in this town. I mean, you can see behind me the creek is very narrow, and had the ships been launched in the conventional fashion, that is launched stern on into the river, they would have simply blocked the river and got stuck sideways. So the launch itself was quite spectacular and used to attract thousands of people.
Pollock's Shipyard was owned and managed for nearly 100 years by members of the Pollock and McLennan families.
Oh yes, with a yes, Marmite, that's right.
Mary McLennan has lived in this house in the Kentish countryside for nearly 50 years, and both she and Sheena Salmon, the daughter of Marshal Pollock, remember the launches well.
As a family, we didn't go to the shipyard very often, only for important launches. They had a platform where the lady, who was usually the wife of the owner of the boat, launched the boat. And when you launched the boat, it was a bottle of champagne that had to be smashed against the side of the boat. And it always had to break. It was unlucky if the bottle didn't break the first time. And it was always exciting because the men started knocking the chocks away from underneath the boat and the poles, and then there was a sudden silence. And then Mr. Carter used his axe to cut the rope that held the chocks, and then the boat would slide silently down to the water, and it was incredibly quiet. And then you had the great whoosh of the water and that incredible thing that you thought the whole thing was going to sink. But it didn't. After every launch, once the boat was in the water, they used to play Rule Britannia, but it was an appalling recording, very crackly and noisy, and I don't know how anybody actually realised what it was.
Faversham has always responded to the nation's call in times of crisis. In 1588, the town provided the Hazard, a ship of 40 tons, to help defend the country against the threat of the Spanish Armada. This creekside warehouse was already over 100 years old when the Armada set sail. And Faversham Creek was chosen as the site for their shipyard by James Pollock Sons at the time of another national emergency.
James Pollock's Shipyard came here in 1916 at the direct request of the first Sea Lord to actually build ships for the war effort in the First World War.
The site of Pollock's Shipyard is now a modern housing estate. Before Pollocks came here, it had been a brickfield, where Thames barges loaded up building materials for the expanding suburbs of Greater London. But from 1916 to its closure in 1970, Pollock's Shipyard built and launched over 1,200 ships from this site. Its operation was central to Faversham's prosperity.
The impact on this town was enormous. I mean, they were the biggest employer for many years, employing upwards of 200 people. But everybody in the town was aware of this shipyard because it's a small town and the shipyard was very near to the centre. And so everybody would have seen the ships growing up on the stocks and would have been aware when the launch was imminent. And equally, I mean, they couldn't have escaped the terrific din that was going on from 7:30 in the morning until the close of the shipyard in the early evening.
If the wind was in the right direction, you can actually hear the riveters and the caulkers throughout the time that the yard was actually in operation. It was just a lovely sound, absolutely lovely sound.
The first chairman of Pollock's was Walter, James Pollock's son. He was known to his workforce as WP.
I hadn't been in the yard many weeks, and someone was shouting out, "Here, here!" I looked across and he said, "Yes, you, here." And I went across, he said, "Hold the dog." Damn great dog it was, it's a miniature pony. So I held the dog, and of course, directly WP vanished, the dog vanished. I thought, oh well, he's found the old man, that's good enough. Anyway, later in the day, Mr. WP came round, he said, "I want to have a word with you." He said, "I gave you a task to do this morning." He said, "I told you to hold the dog." I said, "Yes," but he slipped the leash and went. He said, "That's the first job you've been asked to do by your chairman," and he said, "You failed utterly, haven't you?" He said, "You won't go very far here, boy."
He used to come down once a week and you'd see him walking around the yard, and I think if he thought that somebody wasn't doing anything, the next thing you knew, at 5 o'clock they was walking out the gate, finished. He wouldn't mess about.
Pollock's found an abundance of skilled labour in Faversham. Many men had been previously employed at the Thames barge builders, already established on the creek.
There was riveters, platers, carpenters, shipwrights, fitters, blacksmiths.
Plumbers, engineers, loftsmen, all sorts of trades.
When I started in the shipyard in 1936, it was a fitter and turner. The money when I first went in there was 9 and 6 a week.
I started there 1935. Well, things was a bit slack then, and employment was, job to get a job anywhere any good, like there's only farm work and brickfield. My father didn't want me to go there, so he got me down there. And that's where I went, and my brother went there, he was a plater. My younger brother went there, he was in the loft, assistant in the loft there. Because then I was driving cranes and the lorries. I finished up just a lorry driver and a crane driver, anything really.
A shed for plating had been set up. Some of the machinery was new, some bought second-hand from King's Lynn. A carpenter's workshop was established, and an extensive display area for Bollinger Engines, a Swedish firm for which Pollock's acted as agents. Phil Ellis was an early recruit in the drawing office.
I never knew of any real unpleasantness, because in other yards you get problems between trades, but it didn't exist at Pollock's. I mean, a plater got on quite well with a shipwright got on well with a joiner.
The friendship amongst all the shipyard workers was second to none. You knew everyone, everyone knew you, you helped everyone, and it was grand fun.
Oh, we used to have some laughs, didn't we? Always playing jokes on one another. The first fitter I went with, he used to send me to the store for a struggling bar or a left-handed screwdriver. And because being green, he used to go to the store and ask for these things.
We had a rivet team working away on the tween deck of the coaster that was under construction. But this particular lad had a marvellous reputation as being a dead-eyed dick with a catapult. And they were looking across the creek, and there, on a barge, was old Captain Ward making water in the creek. So the rivet boy looked across and he said, "I could hit him from here." He said, "Don't talk silly, you couldn't hit him from here." He said, "I could," and he bent over and he got a 5/8 rivet and he pulled back and chum. And there was a long silence. "There you are," he said, "missed by a mile." And he'd hardly got the words out of his mouth and I walked, "Ah!"
You never earned much money there, but when you went there in the morning at 7 o'clock, you can guarantee you would have several laughs during the day.
We spent a lot of time skylarking around, a lot of time.
Everyone had a nickname. There was one little lad, his mother used to make him pullovers out of oddments of wool, so he became Technicolor. And there was another young man, he never had a lot to say, but on the launch day, when Charlie Carter would be viewing the tide, he would walk behind Charlie saying, "High tide." So of course he became High Tide.
Charlie Carter, the foreman shipwright, always wore white overalls. His daughter Vida, who still lives next door to the house in which she was born, remembers washing them in preparation for launch days.
We used to lay them on the ground outside the back door. Buckets of soap. Mum used to hot the copper out for hot water. I used to get the yard broom and scrub them. Then I used to have to throw cold water over to rinse them. Then as best as I could fold them up and put them through the mangle.
He was a good old boy, Charlie. If you wanted a pot of paint, go and see Charlie. The only trouble with the paint was that everything used to be battleship grey. So you could always tell when somebody got a pot of paint from the yard, because in their house it was battleship grey, wasn't it?
I knew Charlie all my life, and he was a wonderful man. If you asked Charlie to do something, it was now. He didn't wait, he did it now, always. I mean, he was not only the senior foreman shipwright there, he was the father of the yard.
Though Walter Pollock was the chairman of the firm, he suffered from poor health and spent much of his time writing books. That left a space for his son, Marshall.
My father did his apprenticeship at the shipyard as soon as he left school at 16. And by the time he was 21, he was a qualified marine architect and mechanical engineer. And he took over the yard. He was manager of the yard at 21.
From the start, Marshall was much more approachable than his father.
Marshall was different. Marshall had charisma. You had to like Marshall. There was no ifs and buts about it. He had a marvellous way with people, because I can remember going up to see him one turn about a rise, and he listened very patiently to what I had to say, and then he said, "What are we paying you now?" So he wrote it down on the pad. He said, "It's not a lot, is it?" I said, "Well, that's my feeling, Mr. Pollock." He said, "I only wish I could afford to pay you what you're worth. Good day."
He used to come on board the boats and watch you doing it and asking you all the questions. How's it going? He was interested in all aspects of the boats, you know, the shipwrights, the carpenters, everything.
Almost every day you walk around and he would chat to various people and ask them, you know, how they were getting on. But yeah, I would say he was a good boss.
We never had to build them to a time limit. Marshall Pollock never, ever took an order which said you will have this boat done by such and such a time, because he was perfectionist. If he didn't like it, You took it apart and you've done it again.
The craftsmanship in the yard was superb. There was no question about that. In fact, the workforce, I reckon, was one of the best in the country, and I travelled extensively after the yard closed, and I never saw anything better. Foremans kept a very, very sharp eye on production, right down to the smallest detail. Everything was meticulous.
All the chaps that worked at the yard had a certain amount of pride in what they did. You saw a ship being built up. We installed the engines and all the electrics, and the day we started the engines up was something to be remembered, wasn't it? You were taking the thing from being dead to being a live machine.
The types of vessel constructed by Pollocks changed with each generation. James, the firm's founder, had built up a valuable list of contacts throughout the world during his early career as a ship's engineer. After he set up as a marine architect, he sent many of his vessels out as deck cargo to clients throughout the southern hemisphere. Walter, who supervised the move to Faversham, had specialised in vessels for the home market: tugs, sailing barges and canal narrowboats. But the war effort required a radical departure.
When they first came to Faversham, they were actually building invasion barges. They built several large monitors which mounted 9-inch guns and which were used in the First World War. And towards the end of the war, they started building concrete vessels.
Concrete ships, made necessary by a shortage of steel, were difficult enough to design and build. They proved almost impossible to steer. Though Pollock's 2 concrete ships were launched successfully, their subsequent careers were not crowned with glory. The Molliette collided with Tower Bridge and was subsequently pensioned off to become a nightclub off Clacton. The Violette collided with Southend Pier, causing considerable damage. She herself was declared a total loss. But after the end of the war, these setbacks were quickly forgotten, and the shipyard fell into a regular routine.
Their bread and butter work was actually very much related to the London docks, and they made hundreds of lighters.
There was not much excitement about them. I don't think they had anybody down, no dignitaries if you like, on a lighter launch. But of course when you had coasters or tugs, invariably there'd be some local dignitary down there to make their presence felt.
The launch might be an occasion for Pollock's directors to celebrate with their clients. But for the workforce, the job was just beginning.
The boat went into the water as a shell. There was no machinery in it at all.
And we put the life into it, the engines, the pipe work, everything. And then when the first day comes, start the engines, just to feel the tremble of the boat. It's working. Perfect.
Whenever a new ship went out of the yard, there was always such pride with all the working people. Everything stopped to watch it leave the jetty. We used to dash out into the North Yard and climb onto something and watch the ship take the turns round the bends and out of the creek. And I've often thought if Mr. Pollock had his binoculars trained back at the yard, he'd have been rather disappointed at the number of people that weren't working.
After completion, Pollock's ships would steam or be towed out to the Swale to be put through their paces in a series of sea trials over a measured mile.
It was along there, but halfway along there between here and that corner. One post and the other post is up there. And it was to measure the speed of the boat, like how many knots I expected it was doing. I think that's what it was. And I'd be sitting up here waiting, like, you know. I got ship-to-shore radio I had. So one day they could talk to me and tell me what he wanted, and I'd nip back to the yard and get it.
Marshal Pollock took a close interest in the sea trials of his ships. But by the late 30s, Marshal Pollock was a worried man. a long and profitable association with the Swedish engine manufacturers Bollinger had come to an end when Bollingers opened their own London office. Competition from Dutch shipbuilders and a lack of investment in new technology, such as welding, had caused a downturn in orders, and the workforce was beginning to question the working regime.
Oh, well, the working conditions were tough because, you know, the yard was exposed and you worked whether it was raining or not. You kept going.
It was quite nice in the summer, very cold in the winter because you had the wind blowing across the marshes.
Especially if it was very frosty, you still had to do your job. And one of my jobs with my apprentice was to put the deck rails round the top of the decks. And we had to do that, frosty, snow, blow, whatever. You had to carry on and do that job.
Above all, there was the incessant noise.
If you happened to be working in an engine room and there were people riveting on the boat, you know, you've got the rivet hammers, and of course in those days you didn't have all the protective gear that there is now.
I'm deaf in my right ear because, you know, the noise was unbelievable. And if you went to the first aid, they give you a lump of cotton wool.
Considering the machinery, like these shears, they're going all the time. There was no guard on them. Well, you couldn't have a guard really, because they'd be in the way of people working.
Lots of people lost fingers. I mean, down through the plater shop, they had overhead shafts, and the machinery, the guillotines and the punches, they were going continuously all day.
And because one of them cut my brother's finger off, like he was running about there, messing about there was. And as you go, and when you're running, you want to get round the corner, you always hold on tight, don't you? That's what we done. The women's shears was going, cut that finger nearly off. Like.
There was a welder there called Ron Wade, who was working over the side of a vessel on a staging, and he went for his tea break, came back after tea, jumped over the bulwarks onto this stage, and they'd come along and moved it, thinking that he'd finished. And he just went straight in the creek.
You're lifting bits of machinery and that weighed many tons, so I mean if you got it wrong, it was no good. Safety helmet, you didn't wear safety helmets then, but I mean a safety helmet wouldn't save your head.
Inevitably, there was the occasional serious accident.
One instance I can remember, we were going to put some tanks in the engine room. We'd got them loaded up on the truck. We also had a labourer there, he was quite a big hefty bloke, and he climbed up on the back of the truck and driving it round to the wharf where we were going to unload the tanks, it hit a bit of wood or something and threw him off the back, and he banged his head on the plate, and obviously he had a fractured skull.
Such accidents were rare, but it was just as well. Injured workers got no compensation.
I'm afraid the shipyard didn't look after you at all. If you were sick, you were sick, and you got no money. That was the end of it.
But when the war came in 1939, the Pollock's workforce pulled together. Many of them volunteered for the Home Guard or Civil Defence Volunteers, and Marshal Pollock's concerns about falling business were soon laid to rest. Once more, orders started flooding in. As well as a greatly increased number of barges and lighters, there were coasters, tugs, pilot launches, and refuelling vessels for the RAF. Shipbuilding was a classified trade, but in a national emergency, workers might at any time be drafted onto more important tasks.
The Admiralty always had call on skills that they needed. You weren't free to volunteer. I had a dread of getting involved in the army, so I volunteered for the Navy. And I remember this old stripey saying to me, "What do you do, son?" I told him. He said, "Well, you just go and do it," because he said, "When we want you, we know where you are."
Some of Pollock's workers were transferred to Short Brothers at Rochester to build flying boats. Many of the vacancies created were filled by women. Now, for the first time, workers' toilets were fitted with doors. The largest ships to be built in the yard during the war were two Fleet Air Arm auxiliaries, the Ripon and the Sea Fox. They were designed to carry planes between aircraft carriers and shore bases. Each one carried in its hold 4 Seafires, Spitfires with folding wings, adapted to fly from carriers, and a light bomber on the deck. Sea Fox had her sea trials on a momentous day, VJ Day, the last day of the Second World War. Pollocks had done well out of the war, and there was an expectation that Marshall would spend some of his profits on updating the yard's obsolescent equipment. But to the surprise of his workforce, he went into property.
There was a grocer shop in Court Street, and further along you got the big restaurant near the Market Pump there. You had that, and then round the corner in Preston Street you had a big furniture shop. No, 2 or 3 shops in one really. And then he bought the one next door. It was Outfitters. Just up the street was another one. It was Man's Outfitters. Then he bought the big club down East Street, where we had billiard table and everything in there, like dances. Then he had 3 pubs. It's the Hardy Ferry house there. One in Preston Street, the Hole in the Wall, and the Shipyard at Conyers. He had them 3. Oh yes, he was in for everything. You know, you wouldn't thought he'd mess about with things like that when he's got a shipyard, would you?
Marshall Pollock also indulged his taste in fast cars. The apple of his eye was a supercharged 1935 Mercedes-Benz, the car in which his daughter Sheena went on honeymoon when she married. But there were many others.
Well, when I first went there, he had a Lagonda, a big green Lagonda. And after that he had an Elvis. Then he went to change to a Jaguar. That's what his daughter had for driving.
And then he had a Bentley, and then he had a brake, an army brake, which we went to the races in. And then he bought some army tanks, about 3 of them I think. And they used to sit in our field for years and years and years. But one of them, he had the top cut off it, the gun turret. And we used to use it as a sort of tractor in the garden. And I learnt to drive on it when I was about 13.
See, he bought these at a big army sale. And he bought the 2 ducks. And the one was a hell of a big one, like we never used that. The other one was just a job, see. Of course, you've got the gear lever for your wheels, like a car. Then you have one for the propeller.
The Duck was ideal for taking Pollock's customers out to the Swale to watch their ships being put through their paces. Sometimes Charlie Leonard drove the Duck. Sometimes his friend Stan Flowers took the wheel.
We always used to have to go up to the station to pick up the boat owners and take them down to the ferry. And he sat there, we all sat there, and I drove from the station happily, and they were chatting away, all in their best suits. And when I got to the Arty ferry, I could engage the gear for the prop, propeller, and go straight in.
The surprise got the better of one of Pollock's customers.
He panicked, he thought I'd lost control. And he jumped overboard, floating down the swale. Pollock was laughing his head off, you know, because he did look a bit of a sight. But we went and got him back.
During the catastrophic floods of 1953, many of Pollock's employees enjoyed an enforced break from work. But for Marshall Pollock and Stan Flowers, there was serious work to be done, and the Duck was the ideal vehicle for it.
We got a message through at 6 o'clock in the morning that this coach was stranded on the way to Sheerness because the tide was so high it just got stuck on the seawall. So they waited there, and we went out there and fetched them in. After that, we were called out to a farmer down at Ollie Shore. He'd been out there overnight to see to his cattle, and he got stranded. Then we went down to Whitstable, feeding people up in their houses because they couldn't get downstairs. So that was quite a good job, that one.
The Faversham News went to town on the story. In his amphibious jeep, with a 60-mile-an-hour wind thrusting great waves over them, Mr. Pollock and Mr. Flowers made journey after journey over a period of 20 hours, rescuing people from exposure and exhaustion and taking them to safety. Marshall also made sure that his pub, the Ferry House, was well stocked with provisions. At the shipyard, the commercial prosperity of the war years had continued for several years afterwards. One particularly unusual vessel was the BP Haulier, equipped with a Voith-Schneider propeller which hung vertically and incorporated several movable rudders, so that the ship was effectively steered and propelled by the same mechanism. The Haulier was able to navigate in very shallow water. As usual, Pollock's directors and representatives of BP assembled to give her a ceremonial send-off. And Charlie Carter, by now aged 74, did the honours with his axe.
The BP Haulier was designed basically to run up and down Faversham Creek, carrying spirit to the BP depot, the opposite to the shipyard. The fact that she could come back up the creek stern first meant that she could go out head first as soon as she was empty. She used to be able to come and go on one tide, which meant that she could get quite a few trips in 1 week.
There were a number of other exceptional vessels built by Pollocks in the 50s. The tanker Ulco for the Union Lighterage Company. The Cosray 25, built for Costain, for construction work in the Niger Delta. A reclamation vessel for the Port of London Authority, romantically named PLA 18184. And the Seahorse, a combined salvage vessel and buoy lifting ship for Southampton Harbour Board. But it was becoming clear that Pollocks were being outcompeted, both at home and abroad, and in danger of being left high and dry.
Shipbuilding was on the decline. You know, we used to read the magazines and the, the literature, and we found that lots of ships were being built undercover. I mean, Pollocks are totally outside.
Technology was moving so fast, the whole technique of shipbuilding was changing, and we were not there.
Friday night, after the Hooters had gone, they all used to line up on the office side, and you'd have a queue halfway across the yard, wouldn't you? Everybody queued up for the money. And all the money used to be put into a tin with your number on. And as you went through, you say your number, and they give you your number with your tin, and the money stuffed in the tin. Yes, and that went on right to the last days. It never got anything modern at all.
Towards the end of my apprenticeship, there was the Isle of Grain refinery being built. There was like Dungeness being built. There's lots of contract work going on. All us kids were hearing of what money they were earning on these sites. Blokes at the Isle of Grain were earning sort of £25–30 a week. And we just couldn't wait to leave.
One country that was beginning to worry us was Japan, because of course Japan was now getting ahead with modern techniques, and the Japanese were offering fantastic deals, which of course we couldn't offer. Added to that, our big bread and butter line, swim barges for the River Thames, was becoming a thing of the past, because the technique of unloading ships was changing with forklifts and customised cranes for containers. So the poor old humble lighter was dying. So yeah, all in all, we were disappearing.
I remember my father coming home one evening about a tender, and saying, we have got to make a profit this time, because they were quoting very, much lower than they should have done in order to get the tender. And it comes a stage when they had to make a profit.
Pollock's got behind with the times. They didn't buy any new machinery, still used all the old methods, and eventually it caught up with them, didn't it?
By the 60s, the situation was grave. Only an order for 3 tugs from Alexander's kept the company going.
I named the ship Sun 3. May God bless her and all sail in her.
What a waste.
There she goes. Yes, quite a worry, really.
At the launch of Sun 3 in 1966, the guests were determinedly cheerful. But in an interview, Marshal Pollock didn't underestimate the company's problems.
Very difficult indeed, very difficult indeed. One is short of good skilled labour, prices are unrealistic, but I do think that there might be a little bit of sunshine round the corner.
A few months later, Marshal Pollock was dead of a heart attack.
I don't think a lot of people knew that Marshall was as sick as he was, because he still used to walk around the yard and chat with people, but apparently he'd had 2 or 3 minor heart attacks. When we found that he died, everybody was devastated.
Here we are at one of the launches. Yes, there's me.
Yes.
And there's Alan.
Alan McLennan, Mary's husband and Marshal Pollock's nephew, became managing director. But he was faced with an uphill struggle, and in less than 3 years, he too was dead, at the age of only 38.
He'd been yachting with his brother, and they were out on the yacht, and he had a heart attack. His brother had to navigate the yacht back to Ramsgate with him on it.
I think everything was in the turmoil, wasn't it? Because the shipyard was getting very close to the bankruptcy stage, and prior to Alan's death, his mother had mortgaged her house and so forth to put money into the company, and it was a sad day when people found out that things were getting so bad.
Phil Ellis now became Pollock's 3rd managing director in 3 years.
We had no hope at all. And we had an emergency meeting and decided that the time had come to call in the administrator and put the firm in his hands.
And that's when the shipyard closed.
Yes.
And it's the main story in the Faversham News. All work will cease today at the Faversham Shipyard of James Pollock Sons and Company.
The worst time for me personally was to face all the people who I'd known all my life and tell them that their job had now come to an end.
On Friday the 27th of February 1970, James Pollock's shipyard finally closed its doors. It had provided the heartbeat of Faversham life for over 50 years.
It was a sad day for everybody. Unfortunately, there wasn't much redundancy money paid out, so everybody got stood off, and they got stood off with nothing. And someone would work for years at the shipyard, and they never run any pension schemes, and at the end of the day, nobody got anything out of it.
Very surprised when they did shut down, like. You thought you'd be there to retire, really.
Oh, gutted, really was.
My own opinion is it was a great shame when the shipyard closed.
It was a sad day, because one thing that Pollocks did do, they provided work for the whole range of people. Even old Ponk Gamble, who was blind, there's a job for him. He sat on a bench all day, cleaning nuts and bolts, so it was a great loss to the town.
I loved the job, really did, because you go on board a boat, it's empty. We put the life into it, the engines, the pipe work, everything. And then when the first day comes, start the engines, just to feel the tremble of the boat. It's working. Perfect.
I loved it. It was hard work sometimes, and it was cold, and it was bloody wet, but I loved it.